2006, Hugo Chavez goes to the UN General Assembly with your book, and then we found out about your connections with him, and then in 2011, you have publicly criticized him for the detention of Judge Afuni. I'm just very curious about your personal thoughts about his legacy in general.
Well, it's actually, that UN visit is interesting. He did something quite important at the UN. I mean, showing off the book is a joke, you know. But of course, that's what the press was interested in. Yeah. But he actually gave a very interesting talk at the General Assembly. I think it was that year. It's probably on the internet. You might look it up. Venezuela is, of course, an oil producer, and he suggested he said at the General Assembly that the producers and the consumers of oil ought to get together and work out ways to reduce the use of fossil fuels, because it's very destructive to the environment, and they ought to be cooperating on this. Outside of Korea, Ecuador is the only oil producing state who ever suggested cutting back on the use of fossil fuels. Now that was important, much more important than any of the shenanigans at the UN, you know, calling Bush a devil, holding up the book, but the press wouldn't touch it. Yeah. It's too constructive.
Do you think that in general, his rule, especially around 2010, especially with the Judge Afuni case, did it go sour at one point, do you think? Do you feel
there are human rights violations. This is one. It's interesting about the Afuni case. I mean, I've been involved in endless activities about human rights.
You wrote a letter.
Turkey. Yeah. Well, Turkey alone, I've done 1,000 times as much as I did on Afuni, but it never gets any attention. The Afuni case got a lot of attention. Mm-hmm. Article in the New York Times, interview in the Guardian, International. The reason is because I was criticizing an enemy of the United States. And if you criticize an enemy of the United States, then it's wonderful. Mm-hmm. If you criticize an ally or a client of the United States, can't mention it. You know, so that's why this case is known. But in my own activities, it's a very minor example. As I say, Turkey.
And one of many.
Turkey alone is.
I have another one from Turkey.
A lot more than that. But that could never be mentioned. That was. I mean, there are other human rights violations, a lot of problems, but and it's a mixed legacy. I mean, there were some things that were quite good. The poverty level's been very sharply reduced. The literacy went way up. Health standards have improved. In part, they've improved through very sensible relations that the West bitterly condemns. There's a kind of a barter relation between Cuba and Venezuela, which makes perfect sense. They're each pursuing their comparative advantage, just what economists sort of applaud. Mm-hmm. Venezuela has oil, Cuba has highly trained personnel, very effective in fact. So they're trading. Cuba gets reduced prices for oil, Venezuela gets teachers, doctors, and so on. And the Cubans are quite remarkable. The West doesn't like to talk about it, but their humanitarian aid to the third world just dwarfs what the West does. I mean, it's not even comparable. They're a tiny country under attack. I mean, when they send doctors to a country, you know, say after the big earthquake in Pakistan or to South Africa or wherever it is, they go live in the villages. They go to hard places where Western doctors and native doctors in the country don't want to go. Mm-hmm. And they do really hard work, very constructive work. I mean, people in much of the third world just look at them with awe. Mm-hmm. Haiti, Pakistan, all over. And in Venezuela too. It's quite a remarkable feat for a small country under constant attack by a superpower.
That's right. But, and their relations with Iran, for instance, how would you categorize that?
Well, I mean, what about Turkey's relations with Iran? Turkey was increasing trade with Iran. Turkish-Brazilian, Iranian deal made a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, as you probably know, it was proposed by Obama.
And then,
but as soon as, because he assumed that it would never work.
It would never work.
But as soon as Iran agreed, they immediately denounced
right.
Brazil and Turkey for doing it. And Obama raced through sanctions at the UN. But that was quite sensible. In fact, Turkey and Iran are very natural trading partners. I mean, Iran needs manufactured goods and technical materials, the kind that, and the Turkey needs energy.
Yeah.
So it's perfect trading relation. The U.S. is trying to block it, of course, but you know, I don't know exactly what Turkey's doing now, but the other countries like China and India are, they can't defy U.S. sanctions,
Mm-hmm.
or they get cut out of the international financial system. But they're evading them in various ways because they don't agree with them.
Mm-hmm.
So they have various, like for example, China is linked up with a Pakistan-Iran pipeline, which is a way of getting Iranian oil.
Yeah.
And India is building a port in Iran. But the U.S. doesn't like it, but there's a limit to U.S. power.
Yeah.
Turkey was doing that for a while, but I think, as far as I know, Turkish-Iranian relations have cooled recently over
Yes.
Middle East regional issues.
That's actually a good segue for the next one. I know you recently visited Boğaziçi University in Istanbul,
yes.
And I did see that footage. What were your impressions? I mean, I understand that it's the last time I visited with you, you were also at a human rights, freedom of speech conference.
Yeah.
What has changed in your opinion? What is improving and what is stalling?
Well, first time I went to Turkey was around a little over 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, and that was right at the end of the peak of atrocities and crimes. It was awful. Since then, through this millennium, the situation's improved. Definite improvement. Far from perfect, but got better. On the other hand, the last couple of years it's starting to get worse again, with the repression increasing and so on. This particular occasion, as you may know, was a memorial lecture for Hrant Dink. Yeah. And the political activists, the kind of people I know, most of them think that he was probably killed by the government. If they did it, it was a tactical error because it created a big backlash.
Yes.
In fact, a lot more concern over the Armenian issue.
Minorities in general.
Minorities in general. This time there was a big demonstration, march through the streets of Istanbul, demonstration outside of Agha's place where he was assassinated. A lot of enthusiasm. It's been this contradiction in Turkey all the way along, right through the 90s, the peak of atrocities. It's very repressive, but a lot of resistance.
In our last interview, when it was printed, it caused, of course, some question marks about your views on the Erdogan government. Now, there are cases in which, of course, there are a lot of journalists who are imprisoned. Freedom of speech.
Got the world record. Right
world
now.
record. And recently, I don't know if you're familiar with the case of Fazıl Say. Fazıl Say was a musician, a worldly renowned musician, who is now facing a probable 18-month sentence for saying something, tweeting something against Islam. What is your general view about the Erdogan government and this particular repression and where it's going, even with the current talks with the Kurds in a different fashion? What do you think is different?
Well, there are talks. There was an article in the New York Times about it today, which presented Erdogan as very forthcoming, looking for peace. He's willing to drink the hemlock if that'll bring peace. Most of the people I talked to in Turkey felt it was mostly for show. That didn't really take it very seriously, but and they thought that many thought that he should be talking to the BDP, and also even to the people in Kandil Mountain, because because Öcalan is kind of removed from what's happening, having been imprisoned. And, if there are to be serious negotiations, it should bring in the civilians and also the real PKK, not a symbolic figure.
Yeah.
And
there's also a theory that this is merely symbolic to get a different system where he would be the president instead of prime minister.
With
Erdogan.
Erdogan, yeah. Well, I'm sure there's plenty of political maneuvering and motivation behind it. But the current trajectory is not very good. Now, the repression's been increasing. As I mentioned, Turkey now has the world record for imprisonment of journalists. The Reporters Without Borders, which monitors journalists, published a special monograph about Turkey just a couple months ago because the situation is getting so bad.
Yeah.
And that's not good. The Islamization is threatening. On the other hand, there are at least symbolic, maybe more steps towards trying to for reconciliation. There's been some improvement in the rights of Kurds, not enough, but some. So it's and there's a lot of resistance, which is the most positive thing.
Speaking of Islamization, this is the second part of the piece that I'm working in. It's regarding your views. Starting from 1994, I'd like to, if you don't mind, just quote exactly what you said in 1994. My curiosity is what your thoughts are now after 9/11 and current developments. You say the inability to participate in a meaningful fashion in the political arena, which may have a rather important psychic effect, heightened by the striking disparity between the facts and the ideological depiction of them. What's sometimes called the ideal culture is so radically different from the real culture in terms of the theory of popular participation versus the reality of remoteness and impotence. That's not impossible. People will find some ways of identifying themselves, becoming associated with others, taking part in something. They're going to do it some way or the other. If they don't have the options to participate in labor unions, political organizations that actually function, they'll find other ways. Religious fundamentalism is a classic example, you said.
Probably I was referring to the United States.
Yes, you were. You also give some Islamization references as well. Religion in general, I think, was being discussed.
I mean, it happened as secular nationalism was destroyed, partly by external force, partly by internal corruption. It's a mixture. But as it essentially disappeared, like, say, the Nazarite Egyptian Qasim in Iraq and so on, as that was destroyed, there was a rise of Islamic fundamentalism.
Yes.
But not simply by accident, like Saudi Arabia, which is the most extreme Islamic fundamentalist state in the world, and is also kind of a missionary state. They spend a lot of money to try to encourage and sponsor radical Islamization. They've done it in Pakistan, they're doing it in Egypt, they're doing it in many places, Libya. There has been a very definite rise in Islamic fundamentalism, and that's pretty natural.
Yes.
It's a little, and there is, as you say, I was talking about the United States, very notable here. The significant, I mean, it's always been a very religious country, the United States.
Yes.
I'm kind of off the spectrum, but it had never really organized as a major political force in the past. Today, Christian fundamentalists are a large part of the base of the Republican Party. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that the Republican Party abandoned much of a pretense of being a parliamentary party. They're now in kind of lockstep service to the very rich and the corporate sector. And almost like the old Communist Party, you have to sign a catechism and everyone has to repeat it and so on.
You actually mentioned many times that in the 19th century, you call them brimstone-type preachers. They were encouraged to promote and encourage the businesses as well.
Business funded them.
Yeah.
Well, now it's a qualitative change. Now the Republican Party can't get votes by coming forth on their actual program. We want to take everything away from you and put it in the pockets of the rich. Can't get a lot of votes that way. So they have to find other ways of getting votes, and one of the ways is by mobilizing and encouraging radical fundamentalism. It's analogs to some of the things happening in the Middle East.
I'll put Rob's question in here. Do you think the Tea Party is a function of this or as a result of this?
The Tea Party is very largely a creation of private capital in the media. I mean, it exists, and it's drawing from something real, but enormous funding, enormous publicity, it's similar to this. It also overlaps with it a lot. I mean, the Tea Party membership isn't all that high, but commitment to Tea Party values is overlaps with religious fundamentalism.
Yeah.
Incidentally, Tea Party values are somewhat misinterpreted. There are very good studies of actual attitudes of people who identify with the Tea Party. What are they in favor of? Or other groups that identify themselves as what they call libertarians, small government, get the government off our back, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Turns out that their attitudes are kind of social democratic.
So you do feel that their grievances...
Well, they're real grievances.
They are real grievances.
Undoubtedly. I mean, look, the United States is a rich country. It's not like the grievances in a third world country, but it's kind of structurally similar. So the United States, in the last 30-odd years, has been subjected to a version of neoliberal programs of the kind that were applied in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, everywhere. Always have the same effect. Very harmful to the general population, very beneficial to a very small segment of extreme wealth, wipe out social programs, it's the same effects everywhere. And there's always a reaction to it. I mean, there has to be. The most interesting reaction is Latin America. Latin America was the most obedient servant of the IMF, World Bank, Treasury Department programs. But during this millennium, they've broken almost completely free of it. The independence of Latin America now is remarkable. There's an interesting example of it just about a couple of weeks ago. The Open Society Forum, Soros-funded forum, published a study of participation in rendition. Renditions, the global torture program run by the United States. And over 50 countries participated. Practically all of Europe, the Middle East, of course, because that's where they sent them to be tortured. Africa, Asia, everybody participated. One glaring exception: no Latin American country participated, which is pretty remarkable. For one thing, because it's an exception. For another, because 10, 20 years ago, Latin America was the torture center of the world, run by the United States, murderous torture states all over the place. And it had always been highly subordinated to the United States. But it's broken so free that it's the one area of the world that refused to participate in the U.S. Global torture program. And there's other illustrations.
Do you feel just segueing into Obama's Guantanamo ordeal, do you think the U.S.'s position on this is the same as it was with the Bush years, or what do you think has improved or not?
The early Bush years just were straight, outright torture years. The later Bush years kind of backed off somewhat. Obama, Guantanamo's probably not a major torture center in the world anymore. There's just too much attention on it.
Yes.
So it's an ugly detention center. It's nowhere near as bad as supermax prisons in the United States, but there are plenty of others. Nobody knows what's going on in Bagram, for example, and there are others. So whether torture is going on or not, we have to guess, but I presume it is. There are fairly recent cases of rendition. It's nothing like it was in earlier years, but I don't think this reflects Obama's civil libertarian commitments. On the contrary, he's done more to tear civil liberties apart than Bush did in the United States and internationally. So he's pushed forward very strong attacks on civil liberties in the United States. They're not getting a lot of attention, but they're very real. Actually, one of them is related to Turkey. One of the worst Obama initiatives was a case initiated by the Obama administration against a group called the Humanitarian Law Project, which was giving legal advice to the PKK. And they wanted to charge them with material assistance to terrorism. The Obama administration pushed it all the way to the Supreme Court, where the right-wing justices approved the position of the administration in a very far-reaching decision, which, if you read it literally, it would mean that I'm giving material assistance to terrorism.
Yes.
I mean,
right now, you're
well, I've talked to Nasrallah. If I had a chance, I'd happily talk to PKK leaders and maybe advise them to turn to nonviolent measures. And that's actionable under Obama. It's a terrific attack on civil liberties. It means you cannot give legal advice. You can't do an investigation. You can't be a reporter. Anything that you do that they decide is material assistance makes you subject to severe punishment.
Yeah.
And there are other cases right now. The Obama administration is working hard to push through legislation through the courts now. The lower courts knocked it out, but they're pushing it to higher courts too, which would permit indefinite detention in military prisons. And that's unfortunately not getting much protest. The part that's getting protest is that it extends to American citizens. And in the court proceedings, the federal judge asked the Justice Department, the lawyers, well, would it apply to the plaintiffs? I'm one of the plaintiffs. Would it apply to them? And he said, well, we can't say, because we can't define who it would apply to. Yeah. So the judge threw it out, but it's going up to the next level, and they'll probably win, ultimately. And, the global assassination campaign is a massive violation of human and civil rights, which go back to the 13th century. I mean, the core of Anglo-American law is presumption of innocence. Yeah. If you're Magna Carta, if you're no man can be punished unless unless they have due process, judged by the court of law, by the quick and speedy trial by their peers. I mean, that's in the Constitution. Yeah. And this has just gone to the winds. And there's not even any protest about it.
Speaking of the civil rights issues, that's my last question. The gay marriage issue that Obama supports, that's getting a lot of attention, obviously, and it looks as though that is the direction that he wants America to go into. What were your feelings about that?
Well, he didn't want it. In fact, he was against it at first. The way he put it, his views have evolved on the subject. And that's also true of the Republican right wing. Their views are evolving on the subject. And they're evolving for a very simple reason. If you take a look at popular opinion, it's way ahead of them on this issue, and they can't be that far behind public opinion. And as far as, it's not a class issue. So, the corporate elite couldn't care less. I mean, if a CEO is homosexual, who cares? So for them, it's not an issue.
Not an issue.
So therefore, it can easily move forward. It's important. I'm not denigrating it, but it doesn't illustrate any commitment to civil liberties.
Yes. Mr. Jones, thank you so much. Appreciate your time very, very much. Thank you very much.